everybody, welcome back to the Drummission. And today we have a new feature on the Drummission because we gotta be well-rounded drummers, well-rounded musicians. If you're only practicing how fast you can do your paradiddles, bad. If you're only playing with records or with bands and not practicing your paradiddles, that's bad. If you're not listening to music and all kinds of music and getting to enjoy and love music, that's bad. And let me say this, I'm 62. My first show was when I think when I was 13, 14, little garage band, and I just had the most fun I've ever had in the world. And probably that's when I made my decision. I couldn't say exactly that this is what I'm going to do in my life, is be a drummer. And I played last Saturday that just passed, and I had a blast, the same fun. And even though financially my life has been up and down because I made drumming and music my career, and in the music world, sometimes you're rich, sometimes you're poor. Sometimes you're in the middle. I still have the most fun, and I feel young. I forget that I'm 62. I'm happy behind the drum set all the time. Even when walking up to the drum set, depending on what happened in my life, I may not be that happy. Okay, so before I get to today's new feature, I'll tell you the elephant in my room, we will get to that, is you might see a little thing with my eye here. I've been having a little dermatological event, and let me post her picture here so you can see her while I'm talking about it. I'm a bit of a whack job. No matter what I'm going through, I'll laugh and I'll joke, but my body will manifest different things, and through my life, I have had many manifestations when there's been deaths to close members of my family. And in this case, it was a cat that I had since she was 6 weeks old. Now, I didn't always have her. The last few years, I couldn't keep her any longer because I had to move and I lost my home and things like that. But an ex kept her, and I saw the cat on a regular basis. But she was 20 years old. We had to put her down. And the way things are now, I had to hold the cat and pet her while they gave her the shot. And I literally cried like a baby. And my body, about a week after I do whatever it is that I have to do for the people that I have to do it for, something usually happens in my body to manifest that goes, we're stressed out. And one time, about 40 years ago, I broke out in hives head to foot. This time, I had hives in this area of my face. And that happened about 4 days after Scully was put down. Yes, her name is Scully, was Scully, Dana Scully, after the X-Files. So this video is for her, for me, for you. I hope you had a great life, Scully. And I'm not a big believer in much of anything, but maybe I do now, and we'll talk about that on a later video. Maybe I'll see you again. All right. Welcome to today's new feature, and that new feature is Rock Record Retro Review. The Rock Record Retro Review. So I'm taking albums that touched me, that shaped me, that influenced me, because this is my channel and it's about me. But I'm not that crazy or abnormal that albums that shaped or benefited me as a musician didn't benefit or shaped many others. So today we will be talking about With the Beatles, and I'll post their pictures here, and Meet the Beatles. Two very similar albums. One a UK release, one a USA release. They're not exactly the same, but they're close. So let's talk about some of the politics that was going on to that, and then let's talk about the music. And let's talk about which I think is better, if any at all. With the Beatles versus Meet the Beatles. Okay, let me first talk about my bias. So when I was a kid, and I had a paper route at the age of around 12 or 13, I don't remember exactly. The very first record I bought, I'm going to post that up here rather than this. I'm just going to pick it up in my hands, but I'm going to post it because it's easier. The very first record I ever bought with my own money, I had some records, but they were given to me on birthdays and Christmases and whatever, and mostly they were singles, 45s. But this time, I went down to Cross County Shopping Center, Sam Goody's Music Store, Yonkers, New York, and if you're as old as me and you're from that area, you remember this store. And I think I paid, it was either $6.98 or $7.98, and I didn't go down there to buy Meet the Beatles. I went down there to buy a record because I loved music. I had started to play a little drums at school, just a little snare, like in middle school. It was nothing big yet. It wasn't a thing. It wasn't part of me yet. But I liked music, and I went down to buy a record, and I think that either they had it on sale, or I liked the cover, or something, or I liked the title track for sure, and I grabbed it, and I came home and I listened to it on my long jeans Symphonette. I'm going to post that now, a picture of that. This was a great video to do because it's bringing back memories. My long jeans Symphonette stereo receiver and my BSR turntable with headphones on, sitting on my bed. The stereo was on my dresser. The turntable sat on top of the receiver, listening to Meet the Beatles. And I remember that night, I remember two things: that I bought the record and I was a little upset because it was a little warped and I was doing this thing. And secondly, I was falling in love with the sound of the drums out of the music. I don't know why, but ever since that album, no matter what music I listened to, I gravitated to the drums. I wanted to be the guy playing behind those tunes. That's what happened. So that's my bias. That Meet the Beatles here, Meet the Beatles is the first album I ever bought. However, life goes on. I don't know what happened to all those albums. I think they got thrown away, whatever. Through my 20s, 30s, 40s, I don't have this album. I haven't listened to it in years. About 4 years ago, during the pandemic, I got a turntable again, and I bought With the Beatles. With the Beatles. All right, I'm going to post that again. The UK release, because I was a bit of a Beatles snob at the time, and you know, God forbid, I did not want the US release. I wanted the UK release, and I bought that. And then, in order to prep for this video, when I got the idea of doing the Meet the Beatles versus With the Beatles idea, I bought Meet the Beatles. And I got to listen to it for the first time again last week. So I kind of got, in a way, fresh ears on Meet the Beatles. So even though there's a bias, it's not as if all I had was Meet the Beatles to listen to for the last 40 years. No. So let's get right down to this. Let's first take a minute and talk about what happened. What happened? Why is there a UK release of this album and a USA release of this album, and they're not exactly the same? The politics of that time, and I'm not talking about Republican or Democrat, I'm talking about everything is politics and what was going on. So Capitol Records was going under. They were going broke. See, I think you probably can notice it more right there. But I realized not doing the video was just sheer vanity.
Vanity. Definitely my favorite sin.
And I'm not that vain. I mean, look at me. Oh my God. All right. There's a joke I used to tell on cruise ships. I used to say, if the Catholic Church put my picture up in the churches, they would change their position on abortion. They would make it mandatory. All right. That's kind of funny. All right. Let's move on. So Capitol Records was going under. EMI, who owned the rights to the Beatles music, they owned that. They had plenty of money because the Beatles were already a smash hit in Europe. Not so much in the United States yet. They had not become that big in the US. They had started to, but they weren't enormous yet. And so 1963, EMI purchases Capitol Records. So two things are happening here. EMI gets to make some money off of the Capitol artists. And Capitol had some great artists. They had Sinatra, they had Count Basie, they had Nat King Cole, they had some great artists. More jazz and the pop side of jazz though. EMI had the Beatles, and EMI was thinking, great, if we have a record company in the United States, we can have them produce those albums for the US, not have to ship stuff over and stuff gets damaged and all that. It'll be cheaper and faster. So this was a win-win for everybody. Win-win. Except for Dave Dexter Jr. Let's put him up, his picture up here. Dave Dexter Jr. was what we used to like to call on cruise ships a jazz Nazi. Dave Dexter did not want the Beatles. He thought, that music's for kids. It's just for kids. Only kids like it. I don't want to sell to the kids. This was Dave Dexter Jr. The more I read about him, the more I don't like him. The more he reminds me of like an early Donald Trump. Just a complete, everything I say is the right thing. This guy. Anyway, EMI says, we are ordering you to put out Beatles music. Plain and simple. But, what Dave Dexter, I don't think, realized, or actually, as I listened to this album, I think he did realize it. For the first time in America, in the early 60s, late 50s, because of unions, that's why it's important to get the right person in the White House. Unions are important. They were very important. They brought the wages up in this country. Before that, you really had rich and poor, but now you had a booming middle class. So if you go back 20 years, if a kid worked in the grocery store, he had to come home, take that money, and help his family buy food and clothing and shelter and all that stuff. But now, the middle class, which had become something in the 60s thanks to unions, the household could have one breadwinner, and if the kid went and worked at the grocery store or got a paper route, like myself, he would have income that he could keep for himself and buy, or herself, and buy stuff for themselves. Like I did, as I saved my money and said, yes, I'm going to go buy a record that I want. And that's what teenagers were beginning to want, was rock and roll records. Whether Dave Dexter or the president of Capitol, Alan Livingston, or anyone liked it or not, teenagers wanted rock and roll. They didn't want jazz. They didn't want classical. They wanted rock and roll. So now let's talk about the recordings themselves, the records themselves. Let's do an overview first, an overview. Okay, so one of the main differences between UK releases of albums and US releases of albums was US releases, and not just US, North America actually, North America. North American albums had 12 songs on an album. UK albums had 14. So as Mr. Dave Dexter is looking at with the Beatles song titles, he sees he has 14 tunes, but he can only use 12. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It had mainly to do with publishing rights and royalty payments and all things like that. And there's two sides to those coins, and I'm not going to get into all that with you. That you can look that up and you can find out the reason why we had 12 and they had 14. So let's start, let me post those two albums. Let's start with just the face of the albums. On the With the Beatles album, we see this beautiful black and white photograph. Half in shadows, the faces of the Beatles, And here the Beatles, which had become somewhat of a teeny bopper sort of, if somebody were going to put a little bit of a derogatory spin on the Beatles on the first album, they would say teeny bopper music. And Dave Dexter definitely thought they were teeny bopper music. So that was his mindset. But here, Robert Freeman did this photograph, and I believe between John Lennon, Paul, George Martin, they picked this photo and they put it out as a beautiful black and white photo, because to me, when I see this photo, I see artistry. And yes, the Beatles were pop, they were a little bubblegum, they were a little teeny bopper, but they were saying, we're not just that, we're more. Now let's contrast that with Meet the Beatles. All right, now Mr. Dave Dexter adds a blue tint to the black and white photo. I don't know why. To me, it just cheeses up the photo. Then he adds the top banner for blue, for Meet The, and the Beatles in this ugly brown. If there had to be an ugly brown color you were going to use, this is the ugliest brown there could possibly be, is Beatles. Right? And on some records it was red, on some it was green. They kind of flipped it around, whichever. And it seems to me that Dave was going, all right, teenagers, here's something colorful and shiny for you to look at because you don't really understand music. And that's what, to me, right off the bat, if I was going to take one thing away from Meet the Beatles, it's the cover art. Here's these two covers now side by side. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but With the Beatles looks classy, cool. And it's like I said, the Beatles were saying, yes, we are some of those other things, but we're also the new cool. And here, Dave Dexter's just leaning into that teeny bopper thing. It's just not as nice a cover to look at as With the Beatles. That's my opinion. The other thing that is on this album is that headline. The first album by England's phenomenal pop group. Okay, first of all, it's not their first album. Second, it wasn't even the first album in North America. It was the first album was introducing the Beatles, put out in North America on VJ Records. That was a very small label that did it. And introducing the Beatles really is Please Me with a couple of tracks missing. They were North America, so they also did 12 selections. But VJ Records didn't have much money to promote. They were a very small label. I don't want to get into all that. That's a whole nother video. So here what we have is a blatant lie. And that's why I say he reminds me of Donald Trump. He's a capitalist. He just says, oh, this is the first album ever by the Beatles. No, it's not. Not at all. It reminds me of the tobacco company. You know, corporations at that time period, they thought it was just fine, say whatever they wanted. And the tobacco company is saying, yep, if you smoke cigarettes, you're going to live longer and be healthier.
Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette. Why not change to Camels for the next 30 days and see what a difference it makes in your smoking enjoyment? See how Camels agree with your throat. See how mild and good tasting a cigarette can be.
Staying on the subject of the overall album, let's talk about sound quality and mix. With the Beatles is a much cleaner sounding album. You really hear the articulations of the instruments, the articulations of the vocals. It's just a much cleaner album. It's a softer album. It's a softer album. The Capitol release, not so. It's much louder. So my stereo now is a Sony, and I almost never put that volume knob over 50. It goes from 0 to 100, and I think maybe once or twice it's seen 51, but that's extremely loud. When I play With the Beatles, I usually pop it up around 46, 47. I can't put it that high for Meet the Beatles because that's a loud album. And Dave Dexter was notorious for soaking the album in reverb and echo. And no matter what rock and roll he did, he thought it made it sound better. However, some of Meet the Beatles does sound punchier and louder and more fun. So when I listen to With the Beatles, because it's done so, the mix is so much better overall as far as hearing each individual instrument. Very little mud, very clean. Usually I'm doing research for something for the channel, and I'm drinking a glass of wine, and I'm listening to this album and just enjoying With the Beatles. And Meet the Beatles, I've only had it for a few days really, and you put this thing on and it's loud and it's muddy, definitely muddy, and there's some distortion, but it just makes you feel like, what doing? You know, I cleaned the house and I got that album cranking loud so I can sing along, clap my hands, and when you listen to it, for some reason you're not that concerned that the mix is not that good, that it's kind of a noisy album compared to With the Beatles. So if I was going to put two descriptors on that, I would say With the Beatles has a really good, clean mix. The With the Beatles is clean. Meet the Beatles is fun. All right, let's get to tracks. We're not going to go through track for track or all the tracks. I'm going to talk about some of what I think is the ingenious things or some of what the Beatles are trying to do. So let's start with just some of the opening tracks. The opening track on With the Beatles is It Won't Be Long. It Won't Be Long. Great track. And in John's own words, it never became a single. I'm going to play those words now. It never became a single.
Won't Be Long was my attempt at writing another single. I never quite made it though. It Won't Be Long was the one where the guy in the Times London wrote about the Aeolian cadences of the chords at the end, which started the whole intellectual bit about Beatles. But I still don't hear any Aeolian cadences because I don't know what they are. Sound like exotic birds.
You can see two things in It Won't Be Long. One, John is trying to recreate that She Loves You, yeah, yeah, yeah formula, but it's a much more interesting progression. He uses more minor chords. He opens the tune up with minor chords. There's some cadences, I don't know if that's the right word, in it. Different modes and scales. So it's a much more well-written tune. It's a great, good song. What's the opener of Meet the Beatles? I Want to Hold Your Hand. A real simple rocker. And I gotta say, first impressions are everything. When you put that needle down on the record, that first thing that hits you is either what makes you want to hear the rest of the thing, or it sets the tone for the album. And when you hear I Want to Hold Your Hand, blasting loud off that first track, it's kick-ass. It's just kick-ass. It's just kick-ass. There's a caveat here with the Beatles. After that album was done and released, they then recorded I Want to Hold Your Hand. I Want to Hold Your Hand was released before Meet the Beatles came out, and so they put I Want to Hold Your Hand as the opener for Meet the Beatles, and it's just a better opener for an album than It Won't Be Long. Track 2 is All I've Got to Do on With the Beatles. All I've Got to Do, Ringo plays that groove that came from the American Southern Black R&B sound, and I love it, and it's a slower tempo. It's down around 130, maybe 120 even. I think it's much slower than other tunes that they were doing at the time. And it's only track 2, and you got this slow tune with this very groovy R&B feel, and John kills the vocals on it. He just loved the way he sings it. I love that song. Very well written. And if you ask me, when we get to this, John is best when he's singing R&B. I know he thought it was rock and roll, but when he's singing R&B, he's at his best. But even so, Meet the Beatles, track 2. I Saw Her Standing There. That was the opener for Please Please Me, the first album. That was the opener. You know, 1, 2, 3, 4, down, 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 up. and they're into the tune. Another one that's up there around 150 or something like that. 2 rockers, boom, boom. Oh yeah, oh yeah, these guys are cooking. It's just fun. Do I love listening to With the Beatles? Is All I've Got to Do just a superbly written song? Yes, it is. Once again, more sophistication, clean, well done, well performed. Meet the Beatles, just fun. Tune number 3, All My Lovin'. All My Lovin'. Paul's rocker. What a great rocker this is. Great song. That whole triplet feel, that shuffle, that rock and roll thing they were getting into, harkening back to Buddy Holly and all that kind of stuff that they were doing. Great, great song. Again, keeping with this album. More sophisticated than Please Please Me. More interesting. Experimenting with different rhythms.
What strikes me about the All My Lovin' recording, is John's guitar part. He's playing the chords as triplets. That was a last-minute idea, and it transforms the whole thing, giving it momentum.
So a good third choice for With the Beatles. I love All My Lovin'. It's one of my favorite Paul tunes. Third tune on Meet the Beatles? This Boy. This Boy. Maybe one of John Lennon's best R&B tunes. If there was one cover that I love on With the Beatles, it is You've Really Got a Hold on Me by Smokey Robinson. It's one of the few times that I like the Beatles version better than Smokey's version, and I love Smokey, but John kills those vocals. This Boy, which is similar, John really kills those vocals. What a great song. Now, You Really Got a Hold on Me, You Really Got a Hold on Me is not on Meet the Beatles. Okay, as for the rest of the 2 albums, really, save for covers, they're pretty much the same. They're pretty much the same. Obviously, except for the mixing and things like that. However, if I were to wave my magic wand and I wanted to transform With the Beatles a little bit, I would get rid of Till There Was You, save that for a Paul McCartney solo album later on in life, and get rid of Roll Over Beethoven. It's just not performed very well, not one of my favorite of their covers, and the mix is very thin. There's a little weird thing in the beginning where everything's on one side, then it goes to 2 channels. I don't know. Not my favorite of their covers. I would get rid of those 2 tunes and replace them with I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy. And This Boy becomes a nice counterpoint to You've Really Got a Hold on Me. Maybe put one on side 1, the other on side 2, and that transforms With the Beatles from a good album to a great album. Meet the Beatles, I actually wouldn't do very much to, except, once again, get rid of Till There Was You, save it for the McCartney solo album, and replace it with You've Really Got a Hold on Me. Again, a good counterpoint to This Boy, one on side 1, one on side 2. And to summarize, one more time, With the Beatles is a good to listen to album, enjoyable, which catalogs the Beatles' progression as writers. Meet the Beatles, loud, sure, noisy, sure, too much reverb sometimes, sure, but fun as hell. Anyway, these are my opinions and thoughts. You get your own. See you on the next one, guys.